Hi there, and thanks for joining us for this webinar on Mastering the Next Generation of New Jersey Science Standards. My name is Francis Vigent. I'm CEO and actually a former teacher here at KnowAtom. It's a pleasure to have you all with us today. I'm planning to spend about an hour as we go into what makes the next generation science standards a little tougher. How do the new standards link to Common Core, ELA, and math? And how does this affect methods for science instruction K-12? And sort of wrap up a bit with the idea of how science and engineering practices integrate with art in something that many folks are calling STEAM. To tell you a little bit about why we're having this webinar and our particular interest here at KnowAtom. KnowAtom's based in Salem, Massachusetts. It's a little north of Boston, about 20 miles. And we are really focused on higher order thinking and specifically focused on teaching higher order thinking skills through science, technology, engineering, and math. We have classrooms all over the country, and the reason that higher order thinking is so important in this discussion of next generation science standards is that the standards themselves are focused on higher order thinking and actually developing those skill sets within students through the practices dimension. And by putting students into the role of scientist and engineer, we're actually able to help students engage those practices within the content so that they're actually developing and using the content as the mode of instruction. And that's where things like curriculum materials, professional development, scopes and sequences, unit maps, and all the other things that folks are in assessment, if I haven't mentioned that already, that folks are really focused on now are, kind of come into play. But frankly, those are the sort of tools or end products that are necessary to execute instruction. Right now, with this transition, particularly in New Jersey, folks are, really focused on getting their middle schools, and some folks are even thinking about elementary school at this level, to have implemented or be ready to implement for September if you haven't already implemented some model units already, with the idea that the 2017 NJASK testing is going to be aligned for grade 8, and then 2018 alignment is intended to be in place for grade 4. So kind of putting all these pieces together, districts are, I guess, in all different places. Some have started their two-year implementation plan all the way back in 2014. Others are, refining that and still trying to catch up a bit. The real key to think about is some of, I guess, the misinformation that's going on as people try to make that transition, especially thinking about the alignment of the NJASK testing. One is how districts and classrooms really interpret the New Jersey draft resources, particularly the model science unit drafts that are available now and are becoming, out of final draft into final form over the next few months. So calling these model science units is something that would take, I guess, exception to, even though that's how they're referred to by the state. So when you think about a unit, there's a difference between curriculum and standards, and these units don't really fit either. And what I mean by that is that standards are essentially a regulation. They are a framework of, in this case, with next generation science standards now, they're a framework of skills, content, and phenomena that combine such that as a result of instruction, students are going to be expected to be able to perform particular tasks is not the right word, but to perform specific skills in context and to be able to make relationships between the content and phenomena. And so they're going to be producing evidence. Curriculum's role is actually to knit concepts and skills and phenomena together in such a way that students really are in that role of scientist and engineer and moving from a problem to an evidence-based solution or from a question to an evidence-based answer. That's the role of curriculum. So curriculum is going to involve grade level specific standards as well as reinforcing prior grade level standards and introducing future grade level standards. So that's a key piece that's, I think, lost on folks at this point, many folks anyhow, and because they see grade level specific standards in the grades where those exist, and they think, oh, that's my standard I need to cover. And the idea of an integrated curriculum means that it's really integrated horizontally, September through June, but also vertically. And these model units don't really get at that. They do in a really light sense. So they're not something that's actionable in a classroom. They are something that's maybe the seed for building some curriculum, but they much more are like the appendix to a curriculum than they are anything curriculum related. They aren't the standards because they include information that goes beyond the standards, and so that's why I call them kind of quasi. And that's just, I guess, the way to maybe think a bit about it. The basics in New Jersey for local curriculum, so I guess that's the case here. Thinking about the standards as the New Jersey regulation, and then curriculum being the actual local curriculum implementation. The administrative code only requires that local curriculum contain a pacing guide, a list of instructional materials, different texts at each grade level, benchmarking assessments, and modifications for ELLs and gifted students and things like that. So there's no real instructional materials and so on that are included in this. So certainly not curriculum level. But classroom curriculum requires a lot more than that as well, and I'll show you a couple snippets in a moment of what that kind of looks like. Districts have also, one of the kind of pitfalls of adopting new standards like the NJASK, which have pieces in common with the prior standards, is that you might look at a unit on ecosystems or light and matter, things like this, and see light and matter in one of your existing units and kind of get the sense that these must be really close and the same. The involvement of the three dimensions in the new standards and the fact that those new standards are performance expectations really changes the game in a big way. And one of the issues is that districts have tried to match NJSS standards to existing curriculum and perhaps painted a real kind of broad brush strokes here. And the second piece that's kind of an issue is that as sort of revised topic sequences come together, folks recognize the need to integrate because that's been very explicit in the documentation, so earth science, physical science, life science, but there's also engineering and the applications of science and technology. Inquiry is infused across all of these dimensions, and that's really, all of these strands, and that's where that practices dimension really is a big deal. So having a unit sequence where, there's part A, how does energy move, and then there's these broad concepts and some kind of a formative assessment pointer like this with these units, again, it's inadequate because students to just make an observation and obtain information or identifies cause and effect is not adequate. It's sort of a discrete skill, which is trying to kind of scratch the surface at parts of the practices dimension. But really the role of curriculum and what needs to happen in the classroom is that those discrete practices, and we'll take a look at those in a second, need to come together within an experience within a context, because that's the way that next generation science assessments work. And that's really, not to say that the ASK testing is the end-all for students, but my point is that the point of the new standards is to develop students' understanding of how science and engineering actually develops content, how it extends what we understand as humans. And so involving students in developing that skill set makes them critical thinkers. And that's really the goal here. That's why critical thinking, higher order thinking, the idea of creating, evaluating, and analyzing is so paramount to what these new standards represent. So, if you think that explaining from evidence that all living organisms are composed of one or more cells is sufficient, and you can kind of check the box that if a student can give that explanation that they've mastered the expectation, it's misleading. That's not the case. A student needs to be able to demonstrate and explain that living organisms are composed of one or more cells, really kind of in a backward sense. They need to be able to maybe look at something like the anatomy of a heart or some basic human systems and be able to identify or explain really why, not so much identify, but explain why your heart looks different than your brain. They're both made of cells, they're both part of humans, they're both organs, there are so many things that they have in common, yet they look entirely different. Why is that? Well, because cells specialize, and cells are the building blocks of tissue, and tissue is the building blocks of organs, and organs are the components of systems, organisms like humans. So the point I want to get across here is that I think at this point people who feel like they're ahead of the curve are oftentimes oversimplifying things, and those who feel a little overwhelmed are perhaps a little more realistic about what's involved. And so the most important takeaway from that is not to waste time in getting aligned, but actually to develop units and try them in the classroom, or to actually bring in outside resources and begin piloting those for yourself, understanding how they work. It's a really big key component, because having that knowledge as the new testing comes into play is going to be a big deal. Usually what happens with the testing is, and this is going on right now in DC, Illinois is another good example. Ohio has sort of a quasi-NJASK assessment. The New England Common Assessment Program is very closely aligned. So in that it covers a bunch of New England states, Rhode Island, Maine, Vermont, New Hampshire, and so on. So there are assessments out there. The NJASK is not NJSS aligned, or really a closely aligned assessment. So there's going to be, when that movement from fact-based sort of testing models to which is lower order thinking, understand, remember, apply, to the create, evaluate, analyze level of thinking, it's going to jar a lot of folks, but at least, and I'll show you some examples of this in a moment, at least it's going to help folks understand the expectations better. It's just an unfortunate way to understand those expectations if you have some time to invest now before that testing gets in place. Key shifts here, when you think about it from a classroom perspective, and I pull this up first and foremost, the basis of these next generation science standards are the nature of science and engineering themselves. The idea that science is knowledge from experimentation, that scientists ask questions, and they pursue answers to those questions by developing experiments and using those experiments to produce data, and that data is then the evidence which they can use to support a claim about their hypothesis, their hypothetical answer to that question, and use the evidence with the claim alongside reasoning to form an evidence-based conclusion. That's how knowledge is produced, scientific knowledge particularly. Engineering, on the other hand, uses the scientific knowledge to solve problems. So engineers solve problems. And they do that by prototyping concepts which may solve the problem, and that those prototypes are prototypes of technology. Anything that solves a problem that's the result of sort of human ingenuity and testing is an engineered technology. And so that's how we get technology. So engineers develop prototypes, they test them, they gather data from those tests, they use that data as evidence to support a claim about whether the prototype should be refined or replicated. And so, that's your evidence-based reasoning, your conclusion there. There is some misinformation that goes around, and I've seen this even at the state level at times, depending on sort of which resource you're looking at, that can be misinterpreted. If a student is building and testing something, it does not mean that they are engineering. If a student is building something, it does not mean that they're engineering. If a student is solving a problem by developing a prototype, testing that prototype methodically, so it's a replicable test, a test that produces quantifiable data, and then they're using that data to support a claim about whether that prototype should be refined or replicated, that is engineering. Okay, so when you think about science or engineering in the classroom, if your students are working from a question, developing plans, carrying out those plans, gathering the data, and then forming evidence-based conclusions around a claim in science, and a similar but different process in engineering, where they are developing that, then you're in alignment. If you have that going on, I mean, that is the hardest part for folks to wrap their heads around. Students really need to be in that driver's seat. And that's true of all the grade levels. Grades K1, 2 is a little different. You want more structure around that, even into third grade. But once fourth grade rolls around, you really want students, being able to plan those investigations from scratch. And there is going to be at the beginning, needs to be a full release responsibility, and there's a gradual release responsibility from September through June. But it's really a key component that the students don't only use plans, but they actually generate that plan, because that's one of the scientific practices. Math is at the center of it all, because math is a tool for quantifying, analyzing, and evaluating, as well as replicating what you have done as a scientist or you have done as an engineer, and also for other scientists, engineers, just the general public, to understand as well as verify the claims. Math here, when you think of Common Core math practices and the Common Core math standards, this next generation science inquiry environment is just an amazing opportunity to apply those practices. Use them and really develop them within a hands-on context for sure, and one which is content relevant, content specific. It's really quite amazing. The big shift that's going to be difficult, if you haven't seen it already, is that we're moving from a traditional model to a next generation model of inquiry. And this tends to be actually the biggest issue where we see this is at middle school level and above, where there are content specialists and content-specific licensure around science. And a lot of these sort of pieces come into play, and folks have really settled into this traditional model, and it's difficult to, it's almost a cultural shift at times when people don't understand, well, first and foremost, that the next generation science engineers have really defined this nature of science and engineering, and in fact that this is something students should be aware of and be participating in and be developing a skill set which not only brings about awareness, but an ability to participate in both sides of this equation. So a traditional model is where content flows through a teacher, and that teacher plays the role of expert. They model the facts, demonstrate phenomena, and explain what. And the idea in that traditional model is that a student shows their proficiency by recalling the facts, repeating the demonstrations, and then explaining the phenomena really by summarizing it. So that's where you have to be very careful with the word explain. If your objectives in the classroom are that students are going to be able to explain something, then you really have to take a step back and ask yourself, what is the basis of the student's explanation? If the basis of the student's explanation is something that they have heard before, have seen before, have read about, then that is a traditional model of instruction and expectation. If that picture of explanation that you have in your mind is one where students really have disparate parts. They have some bit of information in a data table, something of a scenario or circumstance, and then the student has to actually develop and use that information with the skills that they have and actually take a bit of their own knowledge, whatever that is, and extend it to that scenario. That's where you start to get into a next generation model of explaining. And that's what you're really looking for. And that's the part where it's really difficult for folks, again, back to that kind of idea, I have a unit on light and energy, isn't that the same? Probably not. And people aren't going to find that out until they see these new next generation science assessments, unless they really understand that nature of science and engineering and understand students being in that role and using not only the practices but the processes of science and the processes of engineering to move from an idea, which is essentially a problem or a question, to an idea, to an actual evidence-based conclusion. And that's where this next generation model comes into play. So instead of the teacher being the one who's sort of handing out the knowledge, what happens is the teacher is functioning to increase or really strengthen the relationship between students who have developed basic skills, those practices, and the content and the cross-cutting concepts. Because the students in this next generation inquiry model really, it's them functioning in the classroom in a context, and with a full release of responsibility and with a clear idea of the expectations of what a scientist and engineer is, what they do, and how they engage content and how they engage in extending that content and using that content. So those that extending and using is the skills. So how you do that, the how and the why, is really the basis of the experience itself. And that's why I was saying earlier that the units, those kind of model units drafts that I was showing you from the New Jersey Department of Education, really don't fit curriculum, they don't fit standards, they're kind of quasi, might give you some little ideas, but not really actionable for this next generation model of inquiry. So think about that teacher. The teacher's crucial. You can't function without the teacher in this environment. What they're doing is they're adjusting supports, they're helping students understand how to engage appropriately, and they're helping redirect and monitor. The student is not explaining by repeating what they've seen, doing the demonstration for themselves at their table or whatever. What they're doing is they're developing and using the content. They're using their skills to solve problems and answer questions. Big ones, not sort of like an essential kind of question type, and depending on what your picture is of an essential question, you have to be careful there. But thinking about removing pollutants from water as being an example, and so if you're part of the issue here is that there are pollutants in water that need to be removed because that water is drinking water. So how is a student going to progress from that to use what they know, look at a base of materials, and actually work with a partner to prototype something like a water filter, and again have it be authentic to their idea? That's what we're talking about here. And then as a result, be able to use their understanding of the phenomena and the dynamic interactions between content to describe the behavior of the system and make evidence-based evidence from the data of their testing of their prototypes, for instance, in an engineering context, to be able to advocate for refining or replicating that solution, and why, essentially why or why not that solution, why or why not the solution solves the problem, essentially, is what we're talking about here. That's why the new standards are written this way in their original form. The student is going to be expected to be able to demonstrate an understanding here, and this is what, and this is just one example from 5th grade. So a student who has learned what they need to learn as a result of classroom instruction will be able to develop a model to describe the movement of matter among plants, animals, decomposers, and the environment. And we should be able to throw that student into any context, and they should be able to demonstrate that expectation. That's the key here. Now, you might say, well, any context, okay, that's infinite, right? And that's true. It is infinite. But the standards give us assessment boundaries, which is great. So we know that the context doesn't extend into the molecular level. So if you're thinking things like microbiomes and even, you know, below, that's really at the outer boundary of what this is getting at. They're thinking of, you know, really multicellular organisms and things that are greater than molecular level. So something like oxygen cycle would be, you know, exchange of matter, but really at a molecular level, which this isn't quite getting at. The other piece is clarification statements, emphasis on the idea that matter, there is matter, there's not food, and it is, you know, it is changed and transformed and passed along food chains and food webs, basically. So that gives a little bit of a sense of the boundaries. But the most important components are these three foundation boxes. So the science and engineering practices are the skills. So think about these as the skills which are not the only skills required, but these are the absolutely necessary skills, ones that you cannot escape having in order to perform this expectation. And so that context, both within the classroom and the assessment, will or should involve students engaging in developing their own model. So they develop the model, not the teacher develops the model and the students see it and do it and use it. The student develops the model to describe the phenomenon. And what is the phenomenon? What are we talking about here? Well, that's this disciplinary core idea context. So the disciplinary core ideas are the content context of this performance expectation where the students are going to have to apply the skills. So here you can see it's talking about organisms being related in food webs, the idea that there are food chains and consumers, decomposers, producers, and so on and so forth. So it's not just that we're talking plants and animals, but we're talking about the actual sort of role or a stage association of that organism within the context of a food chain or food web. Okay, so you can imagine that when we think about things like plants, animals, decomposers, food chains, food webs, and so on, this ecosystems exist and transfer energy and matter in rocky shore context, in marine context, sort of the kind of aquatic, within Arctic and desert, and we just go down all different potential places where we could actually isolate an ecosystem, show a picture, or pull animals and plants from that, and throw the student into that context. And they should be able to develop a model to describe the matter, the movement of matter among those plants, animals, decomposers, and the environment, regardless of where we pull them from. Okay, so long as we don't go outside that assessment boundary. So that's where this really gets at that higher order thinking. The idea that a student can explain from evidence that they've seen previously, that this blows that out of the water, because you just can't predict. And even if you look at all those different ecosystems, are you going to literally cover every organism in the ocean and its association to all of the plants or animals that that organism eats? It's just, you can't. That's why the skills and sort of the habits of mind and the understanding of the nature and relationship between science and engineering, which we looked at earlier, as well as the students' ability to use and understand and actually have internalized the processes of science, or the scientific process and the engineering design process. And just a moment to linger on this is really that folks hear process and they think, oh, this is lockstep, the old scientific method, science is linear, engineering is linear. Well, no, it's not. To involve process is not making the statement that science or engineering are linear by any means. process is just some basic logical tools to move from an idea to an evidence-based conclusion. In fact, it's akin to stepping forward as part of walking or moving. Now, people don't walk in straight lines. It's, curved, nonlinear, and so on. However, moving requires stepping forward. And so there's a basic process to that, right? Just very basic. So to say that science and engineering don't involve process, a basic logic to be able to advance from an idea or from a problem or from a question to an evidence-based solution is kind of it's kind of a joke. And I'll give you an example of this directly from K-12 education. When children learn how to write, we teach them writing practices. What is a writing practice, if you're not familiar? Word choice, voice, tone, sentence structure, so on. Those are the tools to be an effective writer. However, just because you know everything about sentence structure does not mean that you immediately produce a high-quality published work. Engaging in the writing process, so the idea of brainstorming, pre-writing, or drafting, and then peer review and editing and revising, and then so on and so forth, and then publishing, helps you go from an idea to a high-quality published work. Now, what folks will say is, yeah, but we all know discoveries happen by accident, and it's tangential thinking, and so on and so forth. True, absolutely true. But you have to remember that process is iterative, and so that's why different editions of books come out. So same thing, we have glass jars, and then we, with our knowledge of science, and develop plastic jars because they have certain benefits. And then we go from jars to certain kind of packets and so on for carrying liquid. Those are all engineering innovations along the way. So it's important to understand that both process and practice, in the case of science and engineering, have a role in classrooms and in these new standards. The last dimension I didn't mention is cross-cutting concepts. So as students use those skills, they're in that role of scientist and engineer in the classroom, and they're taking their ideas, putting them on the forefront, and developing the content. They're actually observing and experiencing the cross-cutting concepts, which is the systems dimension. Think of it as the phenomena of the content, how the content behaves. So think about water cycle as being cyclical in its behavior. Well, when you start to have things like ecosystems, you also have inputs and outputs. So what happens when there's an increase in fertilizer in the water? Well, that has a cause and effect. That cause affects algae growth, which then perhaps causes certain species which eat algae to become overpopulated, and so on and so forth. And so we can have outputs of that system, which may include certain species dying off or so on, as being the effect. So students need to be able to sort of think in that way that, if a scenario shocks a system, or that when you look at a scenario, that content may have these different types of systems, behaviors, which interrelate and actually have effects. That's the idea of the phenomenon, and then being able to relate. We have water cycles, we also have rock cycles, we have oxygen cycles. There's just so many things like cycle. A student can look and say, yeah, these are cycles. Life cycle, food chain, food web is sort of a cycle of energy and matter. These are all cycles. There are going to be relationships between them that cause interactions, but not, the water cycle is not the same as the rock cycle, and so on. So again, back to really thinking about the idea that if you have a light and matter unit, there's a good chance, unless these three dimensions have been something that you've already involved in your classroom and put students into that role of scientist and engineer, is probably going to be a large shift to be able to become aligned, because that's what alignment really is about. It's bringing these three pieces together in a context and then actually pooling the performance expectations, so you're not doing one at a time, but you're actually, and that's where that introduce, master, reinforce method comes in. You're scaffolding September through June, but also from one year to the next, and that's important to avoid systemic gaps in your curriculum and in your district, especially where you may have transient students or latecomers, newcomers to your district. Really vital. So the science practices, the science and engineering practices, at a real high level, there's 8 of them, asking questions and defining problems. I'm highlighting or changing the color of keywords here to point out that this is the student, not the teacher. It's the student who has developed the skill, who's not relying on anybody else but themselves to be able to do this. Okay, so the student's able to ask the question, define a problem, actually develop a model, actually plan an investigation, analyze the data, think computationally and mathematically, construct an explanation, design a solution, argue from evidence, obtain, evaluate, communicate information. That is on the student. So think about the student going into their next generation science testing. That's going to be the expectation. And that's going to be teased out through a series of questions, most likely related to a scenario, and I'll show you what that looks like. So if a student hasn't engaged in anything but carrying out investigations which were handed to them, sort of a make by number, a follow this procedure, that kind of a thing, inadequate. And they're going to lack that skill, and so you're going to see that on the testing. In the classroom at a second grade level, when you think about that kind of transition from nonfiction reading, Socratic dialogue, coming to a problem or question, which then you break down, students break down into their small groups, teams of 2, to be able to develop their plan and then carry out their plan. That's key. Develop the plan first, and then when you have a plan, you have something to carry out. So it's not activity before concept. Okay, that's sort of an old, dated kind of really ineffective kind of way. You lose opportunities approaching things that way. Let's put it that way. When a student thinks first about what they're doing, purpose, authenticity, and then also student risk-taking becomes engaged, and then they actually carry out their plan, so they see the value of that thinking in investing their time and energy, and also what happens when you don't think of something. That's actually a valuable learning opportunity. As you are engaged hands-on, you have to deal with that. That's really key. So these are second grade students that are engaged in that phase. And then what they're doing here is gathering data, carrying out their plan, gathering data, and then that data, they have to analyze it and then use that analysis to form an evidence-based conclusion. At the older grade levels, like I said earlier, there's less structure in the sense of they're working in blank composition notebooks or a software program that is the scientific equivalent of a Google Doc. And really, you could use something like a Google Doc. The key is that you have version control and tracking, because you want to make sure that students are not changing their hypotheses or their data or so on to match what will allow them to say that their hypothesis or their solution was supported by the data. Because really the nature of science and engineering is that we learn whether something is supported or not supported. It's irrelevant in the sense of proficiency. Proficiency is really the skill of being able to identify and also explain, as a result of your own thinking, the evidence that's available, whether something is supported or not supported. So these are 5th grade level students, and I can tell from what you see here in the picture that they are engaged in engineering at this point. So their class, they have gone through their reading, nonfiction reading, Socratic dialogue, and then they've come to that problem or question, in this case engineering, so it would be a problem. Their team is trying to take that problem apart right now using just what they know from their reading and discussion and figure out how they're going to use these materials to construct a prototype which they can test. So that's huge. It's their idea. Nobody has shown them how to create this prototype. Now they have an understanding of what the practices are. They've internalized those. They are using the engineering design process. So they have a sense of the logic of how you go from a problem to research, survey the available materials, and then brainstorm a few ideas, pick one, diagram it, build it, then test it, gather the data, and use the data to form their evidence-based conclusions. They have a sense of how to do that, so that's something that's known to them. But this particular situation scenario is totally new. They haven't used these materials before. They have no idea the outcome, so they're going to have to try to use their best thinking. you can imagine that what they're creating here is a nonfiction text as well. So when you think about integration, integration is not only the strands, those life science, earth and space science, engineering, technology applications, so on. That's not just the only integration. That creative process, the actual planning, is evidence-based writing in their conclusions. It's a process writing in their, the whole thing is a process writing, engaging in the engineering design process or the the scientific process. But the procedures that they develop, and again, they develop, are process writing. There are specific Common Core ELA technical subject standards, communication standards, writing standards. All of those are being hit in this context, nonfiction reading as well. In the math side, the Common Core math practices, data collection, graphing, application of the quantitative thinking as well as operations in the context of science and engineering all hit math standards. So the only things that are science time on learning, in a sense, is the experimenting and prototyping itself. I mean, all these other components really hit both science and ELA and or math. But think about students in that role again. They have to create, evaluate, and analyze simultaneously here. That's useful in all disciplines, even beyond what I'm showing you here. Keep that in mind. If that's not happening in the classroom, if everything's functioning off of templates, kind of glorified worksheets kind of thing, kind of the old kit model of you got a bunch of materials and here's sort of a sheet to go with it, do what's on the sheet, you know, do the scratch test, collect the data, and try to form a conclusion about it. That's inadequate. Students really need to be engaged in, you know, that creative process, starting at the problem or starting at the question and moving forward from there, not having that given to them, because that's a key element of these practices. So you can imagine that when students are engaged there, they have to create from their ideas. They then have to evaluate, they have to analyze the data they get and evaluate their idea as well as that data to form an evidence-based conclusion. Those are the higher order thinking skills. So we've rearranged, and really this next generation, the next generation science standards and this next generation inquiry environment have rearranged or placed this higher order thinking on the same level as sort of happening simultaneously. The lower order thinking skills, when we think of Bloom's taxonomy of remembering, understanding, applying, are still there. They're just inadequate. It's not enough that you can remember. It's not enough you can understand. It's not enough you can apply. You have to be able to create, evaluate, and analyze, or you're not going to be functioning, highly functioning in the science domain under these new standards. So things like the existing NJASK kind of questions that you see, you know, which part of the potato plant shown above makes the most food for the plant. If you can just remember, identify, that's it. That's all you need to do, lower order thinking. You know, being able here to really think about, you know, essentially air temperature increasing. As the temperature increases, its density increases or decreases. So it's something we would have again, observed. Okay, so it's a result of direct observation. Same thing here with 3, 4, so on. These are all really focusing on lower order kind of thinking skills, either remembering what you've observed, understanding just the basics of the scenario, or applying sort of, you know, a classroom observation to, you know, a specific prompt, very basic scenario. It's not really a scenario, and I'll show you the difference. So what's happening in a lot of states, so when you think about the NJASK realignment or alignment to next generation science standards, what we're seeing in places like I mentioned earlier, DC, actually Illinois is borrowing, they have an item agreement with DC. They're actually borrowing DC test items for their own assessment. The assessment there is taking place at both DC and Illinois, and a few other examples as well, at grade 5, 8, and then high school bio, which is usually grade 10. So again, you know, the idea of where and when NJASK testing is taking place isn't going to change. And it also, when you look at the testing, it's important to point out that it's not only testing one grade level. So if the testing's remain grade 5, it's not just testing grade 5 standards, it's actually testing the grade levels 3 through 5 span, in fact. So thinking again back to the way curriculum in the classrooms being developed and implemented in New Jersey right now, the idea that you have a grade specific standard and that means that you can kind of cover it in that year and move on, it's like a long-term spiral. You're opening yourself up to gaps because the testing models that are still that everybody's adopting here with the realignment to NJASK still involve the whole grade span, grade 5 and below or so on. So want to point that out. This particular assessment in both those examples I gave earlier, Illinois and DC, are computer-based, but they still have multiple choice, open response, and because of computers, they can add something called a tech-enhanced item, like a drag and drop kind of thing, or pick from a menu, pull down menu kind of a thing. Here they use the fancy language, selected response for multiple choice and constructed response for open response. But frankly, these are like 20-something item tests. They're not massive. But what you'll see is that this is the scenario model. Okay, and these have been around for a while now. DC, one of the reasons Illinois went to DC is that they got an early start on testing, basically piloting their assessments before they actually went into play this year as operational assessments. So there's data around this already, but that was even built on other data that has been generating really since probably 2007. The items themselves, this is fictional students, Trevor and Kayla. Here's a scenario. They wanted to plant beans, or they planted beans in their classroom, learned about hydroponics, so they planted some beans in water only and some in soil. And they were interested to know what the difference would be in terms of how those plants would grow, specifically their height. So they gathered data, and then they came to conclusions. And Trevor and Kayla, these fictional students, came to different conclusions. Okay, so the whole scientific process is actually being modeled for the student here, which is kind of interesting. But it's a scenario, and it's the student, the real student who's taking the test, is going to be asked whose claim is correct. Trevor or Kayla, explain why that, whether it's Trevor or Kayla, that claim is correct, and use evidence to support the choice. So this is a constructed response. Okay, so your student, picturing your student in this role, they need to be able to look at this, use those practices, and this is what I meant by you can't teach every scenario, every, this is a bean plant. The fact that you didn't show bean plants to your student shouldn't be a barrier to their success on this exam, because it really relies on their understanding of the nature of science and engineering, their understanding of the practices and the processes. So if they have those skills and a basic understanding of the content, they should be able to answer this question by looking at what was being compared, how it was constructed, looking at the data, and then being able to look at the conclusions and say, well, actually, in this case here, Kayla, just want to take a quick look at this, make sure I don't misspeak. That Kayla's conclusion is supported by the data in week 4, but Trevor's solution in terms of growing faster in soil, I don't, without doing the math here to make sure I'm not missing something, I don't see that the rate between the weeks is faster either. So so Trevor's, Trevor's claim is not supported because the plants grew faster from one week to the next, as well as the final height was greater in week 4 for plants grown in water than in soil. However, it's interesting, the water does provide the nutrients for the plants to grow, but we have to dig back into the example here to see if the nutrients were added or if Trevor actually ever made that claim. So you can see that you can form a pretty robust conclusion around this just using your basic skills, understanding that if somebody says that, uses the word because, they're giving evidence, so is that evidence actually here in the scenario, or is that another kind of fallacy in the claim, so on. One of those tech enhanced items I was mentioning, here's a drag and drop over here, but also a constructed response at the end. Over here there's a multiple choice, but now there are 3 correct answers and 3 incorrect. So it makes it harder for students to just eliminate one or two and have a 50-50 chance of getting a correct answer, and they have to be able to analyze a scenario again. Look at, you have a food chain. Using that food chain model, they're going to ask for a constructed response where the students are going to be able to talk about recycling matter back into the environment. Here you're talking about energy transfer in the food chain, food web, and also matter. But to get for that matter to become available to the environment again, the bacteria has to get involved in terms of a food chain as well as a life cycle. So something like a minnow dies, well, bacteria, that minnow becomes the food for the bacteria. It's part of the life cycle of the minnow to cease living at some point, and the bacteria is going to return that matter and energy to the environment for the algae, and feed this cycle again. So kind of again deeper thinking. You can see the creative, evaluative, and analytical thinking, and then the same thing here: scenario related to multiple choice, 3 correct answers out of 5, and then over here scenario and open response. So back to the idea that you can take curriculum and just sort of stick, take your existing curriculum and sort of stick some practices into it is probably oversimplifying if you haven't learned that already from the task. The task ahead when it comes to going from those curriculum, so the standards to curriculum. And a couple of the key pivots, we actually have a webinar on this if you want to check it out. It's on demand, called How to Assess Your Curriculum for Alignment to Next Generation Science Standards. It's available on our website, KnowAtom.com. Check under resources and live events at the top of the screen, and you'll be able to find it with maybe a little digging. The classroom environment has to engage not just the hands-on aspect, but it has to engage the math and ELA Common Core practices. It's a key pivot under peak alignment. So if you know about EQIP alignment or EQIP guidelines for science, there's also peak alignment guidelines. You should be familiar with those. Those are mentioned in that webinar. And peak is spelled P-E-E-C, 2 E's. But think about the classroom experience over the course of a week as involving nonfiction reading, Socratic dialogue, students breaking into their teams, planning their investigations, and then carrying those investigations out as scientists and engineers now. They're their ideas. You might have 10 different approaches in your classroom, although most of the times it's more like 4. But and then students use that data they gather from their experiment, including their human error, to form conclusions and then share and debrief. I just want to let you know we're hitting about an hour right now. I'm going to take another maybe 10 minutes or so and just bullet through the rest of this. I will take questions on the live session, so if you do have questions, feel free to drop those in, and I will stick around and answer those here for everybody in one moment. So another key pivot is integrating engineering design and the nature of science as practices, the practices dimension and the cross-cutting concepts dimension, and doing that through the process of engaging in science and the process of engaging in actually engineering. Okay, so this is an example of, so a little quick background on KnowAtom here. We have been developing curriculum for 10 years, and as the next generation science standards were being developed all the way back to those early reports, 2006, 7, and so on, and the early drafts of NJASK, we've been incorporating that into our curriculum and actually as we do our yearly revisions and so on. The reason being that it's just great for teaching and learning. Students are more engaged when they can use their own ideas. Wouldn't you rather do something you think up than something somebody else told you to do? It's just how it works. One of the things we've developed through that and really refined is a scientific process and engineering design process that works really well in the K-12 classroom, and I do mean that K-12. So it's 8 steps. I'm not going to go into that in detail here, but you can see in the context of science, we're starting with a question. In the context of engineering, we're starting with a problem. There's some very close, each of the steps are very closely related, but in a different order, because science and engineering serve different purposes. And so students need to understand the purposes in order to really engage and be able to identify and use processes. Now, part of integrating engineering with science means that, if you think about like this grade 7 model example from our resources, students learn about science first. They engage as scientists. They, in their teams, tackle the question of which earth materials are more permeable to groundwater as they relate that to aquifers and the water cycle and states of matter and energy transfer in terms of, or really phase change, not energy transfer, but phase change. In the very next lessons, they're learning about pollution and things like non-point source pollution and how, so intellectually they're making that connection between the idea of the water cycle, groundwater, earth materials and permeability and so on. So that's a context they've just learned and experienced. Now they're learning and thinking about pollution and connecting it to that earlier context and thinking about how is it that over time pollution far away can affect well water, groundwater, and actually become a source of polluting aquifers. And they tackle some of those questions and scenarios by thinking about, for instance, in this case, the problem of a town needing low-cost water filtration devices. And so they engage in engineering design process with their partner to try and create a solution, and then thinking about the debriefing, they come to their evidence-based conclusion, and then in debrief they can actually look at their solution versus their peers and really understand different approaches, but also at different levels of efficiency and cost related to it. And then thinking about, too, integrating those assessments, not waiting for the NJASK to come along, but integrating the assessments by teasing out, using a scenario and teasing out the elements of the foundation boxes related to those standards through really next generation aligned classroom assessments. So thinking about the scenario and then related to that scenario, questions that require students to demonstrate their understanding and really their proficiency with the different dimensions as well. So you can imagine this shows their proficiency of a dimension in context, right? You have a context here, and then it kind of levels along. So I'm going to jump over some of this here just so we can get to questions. We do have questions. But you can see here, following precisely a multi-step procedure, that's ELA Common Core, not science. So when the student creates the procedure, that's science. When they follow it, that's ELA. Distinguishing among facts and speculation, reasoning judgment in a text or so on. Comparing evidence-based conclusions, that's exactly what we're doing, so on. So I just pulled out a couple here to show you, and these are middle school level. Those math practices, making sense of problem, persevering in solving them, reasoning abstractly, constructing viable arguments, all these things, attending to precision. These are math practices from Common Core. They're being applied in the science environment. There is a new definition of effective STEM instruction, and that is here, basically shifting from what you see on the left to what you see on the right. It's not about teachers demonstrating and students being really attentive so they can go back to their desk and do it themselves, but it's about students being in that driver's seat and actually engaging in the practices and processes for the first time themselves. When I say that, I don't mean that it's the first time they use the skill. What I'm saying, because skills repeat over time, right? A musician can play many pieces of music, but the music itself, every time they come across a new sheet of music, is perhaps new at some point. In this case, these two students, this is a new problem to them, but they're going to use their same skills and practices and processes to attack that problem, and they're going to learn something new. They're going to extend what they understand. They're going to come to a conclusion, and that's really that scientific discourse. Much more authentic, much more valuable. So this definition of effective science instruction comes from the National Research Council. So when you think about what you see in your classrooms, whether you're a teacher, whether you're an administrator, whether you're a parent, this is what effective STEM instruction is all about, the actual definition. Engaging on students' early interests and experiences, so that means it starts in kindergarten, and it's an intentional nurturing process all the way to 12th grade graduation, right? Identifying and building on what they know, so it's intentional. That's why I said earlier, kind of criticizing, maybe is a strong word, those unit guidelines. Those are not specific enough to identify and build on what a student knows. They're way too general. Okay, so that has to be really dialed in. and then providing students with experiences to engage them in the practices of science and sustain their interest. So that means a rigorous scope and sequence, not this 3-unit, 4-unit a year model, but in fact more like monthly units, and things that are intentionally articulating September through June in such that it's engaging students in the practices, right? That's what those skills, practices equals skills in this next generation vernacular. So engaging students in the skills and with a rigorous scope and sequence that helps them, is intentionally nurturing their understanding. Okay, so I won't go over this except to say that awareness level resources are kind of your 1-2-page lesson plan you get from a museum. Help students understand, what is a scientist? Knowledge ready, that's a textbook, right? Learning all about the past of what scientists and engineers have discovered. Performance readiness, that's those typical kits, right? We learn all about something and then we have a culminating activity where everybody, gets some hands-on materials and they do a rock test and fill out their sheet with the hardness levels of different rocks or minerals. Students learn to perform a task related to a specific question or problem, specific to gather certain information. Mastery readiness is what those assessments I was showing you earlier from DC, that's what that's really getting at, what you see those students in the classroom doing here, right? Mastery readiness means taking skills and knowledge and extending your knowledge with your skills and being able to do it in a context that's unfamiliar to you, in a very direct instruction sense, unfamiliar, but is related to things that you do know, and that's key. All right, so if you have to help a contractor decide what countertop is most, best for the application in that commercial kitchen, based on some data that you're given, you're not a builder, you've never seen this before, but based on your understanding of, just the basics and what you see in a data table, you're going to be able to understand, interpret durability and make an evidence-based argument about, whether something like marble or granite or plastic or wood or something else is the best fit material for the application based on the data, and perhaps refuting somebody else's claim that may be contrary. That's mastery readiness. It relates to the arts, and you hear about things like STEAM, science, technology, engineering, art, and math, through higher order thinking, because you can imagine that the next generation science classroom, a well-aligned classroom, creates a clearly identifiable culture of critique, academic critique, and that culture of critique is really what drives those critical thinking skills forward, the creative, evaluative, and analytical thinking skills, right? If anything goes, then there's really no benchmark for success, really, and that's the thing. Engineering, building something, does not equal engineering. Testing something and forming an evidence-based conclusion is closer. Going from a problem, developing a solution, through identifying a potential solution, diagramming it, building it, so on, and to actually test it, then get data, and then use that data. That's engineering, because you actually have a benchmark. You have what you created, you have the results, and then you can compare that to others' attempts and people who also replicate what you've done. In the case of art is engineered communication. That's why artists get in trouble sometimes, especially if they live in the wrong place. Artists, they might have an aesthetic that you find pretty or pleasing, some of them, but the role of an artist is not making things pretty. Nobody gets in trouble for making things pretty. Artists get in trouble because they engineer statements within a medium like oil on canvas or sculpture or the English language. That's why we call it English language arts. So they are creating a message, they're evaluating and analyzing that message, and they're targeting it to specific individuals, and you see that really in examples like Pablo Picasso's Guernica, which I have up here for you, because this is not particularly aesthetically pleasing. Pablo Picasso has a specific style which artists would refer to as an aesthetic, okay? But it's not necessarily pretty. But it was an engineered statement aimed at the fascists in the world and exposing what the fascists were doing and the atrocities at Guernica, a town in Spain. And he was commissioned this piece came about because he was commissioned to create the piece as part of an international exposition. This is what he created, and he sent it. So imagine he created this piece displaying all of this turmoil and destruction. You could see people and animals and all of what's going on here. It's a very chaotic and painful scenario and dark. And he called it Guernica, and he sent it off. And as a result, and he did this while he was living in exile in France, and as a result, the fascists in the world came back, the fascists specifically came back to him and said, what did you do? And he said, I didn't do what you did. At least that's the way the story is told. And so you can see just in that statement that it was a very deliberate effort on the part of Pablo to make a statement, and he was making it to a specific audience, and he was effective in doing so. That's what made him a great artist. And so the connection here is not that art is connected to science and engineering because artists make things that scientists and engineers make pretty. It's in fact that, well, perhaps that artists help scientists and engineers communicate something through what they create, but it's even at a higher level than that, that by equipping students with science and engineering skills, that in fact we're equipping students to better communicate and better consume communication. So think about it as becoming better artists and better consumers of art even. So that's in part why the arts struggle, because artists struggle to communicate something in message, and as if there's a shift to lower order thinking skills, society is less adept at actually consuming that art. So this, in some respects, helps that. So I am going to jump to questions now. I know that folks are going to need to leave here any moment, but when you think about curriculum, professional development materials coming together, it needs to fit hand in glove and support that STEM learning environment. I'm using images from KnowAtom. We do produce NJASK aligned, appropriate for New Jersey curriculum, materials, and professional development. There's some images from it. If you want to see what that even looks like, a NJASK aligned unit, you can go to our website and download one free. There's one for each grade level there. You just go to KnowAtom.com and go to STEM curriculum at the top of your screen, and you'll scroll down and see the grades. But the effects of this type of thinking in inner city environments, so here's an example. The state average here is 50%. And this is an example from Massachusetts. 50%. This is an environment where 35% of the students don't speak English as their first language, 72% are low income, 75% are high needs, 65% are free lunch, and yet over the course of 2.5 years they reached 86% or so advanced and proficient students, and you can see maintaining low warning and so on. Now you get these ups and downs because, well, you have changes in administrators, changes in teachers, and so that's a shock to the system. Teachers matter, administrators matter in this, but nonetheless you see the positive trend. The students don't hit rock bottom because by creating that skill set in students and that prior knowledge and so on, students can withstand shocks. It doesn't mean the shocks are undetectable, but they can withstand them. And here's a much different environment where there's only 7% low income, 20% high needs, and you see really huge, I think it's 17 points or so, maybe 20 points of initial gains, and then they continue, and you reach this sort of plateau basically because this is where you are pushing students' thinking, and there's just natural difficulty for students to be perfect on standardized assessments. So at scale, you kind of 80-85% is the kind of threshold where that becomes much more difficult to get every last point, but yet some do and push it even further. Here's an example here, 90%. This is actually, and I'm using Massachusetts example so that you see apples to apples. This is the highest elementary, and actually the district in Massachusetts at 90%, 89% proficient. Really difficult situations. You can see over here 54% warning and failing students to 27% over the course of 2 years. This is an inner city, really urban middle school example. They're now actually, this is where their peers operate, so they're now moving above the average for large cities in the state. There's 26 large cities, going from 4 to 28%, and just show you the demographics there. 64% first language is not English, 16%, 15% English language learners, 95% low income, really big numbers, 87% free and reduced lunch, and so on. And we have that, to show in other states too. New Hampshire, same thing, 30% over state average, and examples, different subgroup targets all being hit and approached. So from accountability standpoints, really, changing, the goal of education should be to change the depth with which students can think, and hopefully increasing it, not getting them to just remember things that they can look up. Has to go much beyond that, and helping them to be able to really analyze and act critically for themselves. So nonetheless, I will end there. Part 2 of the series is strategically implementing NJASK. You can access that here, KnowAtom.com/strategically on demand. And if you have any questions about resources I've referred to or I've shown, I haven't shown too many of the KnowAtom resources. I mentioned you can download on the website. We have only one example because we have to keep our lights on somehow, so we actually do sell those, not to teachers but to districts and to schools. And so if that's of interest, you can reach out about that too. The best person to reach out to about STEM curriculum questions here is Mary Ellen DeLacy. Her email's on the screen, mdelacy@knowatom.com, and her phone number is there. And I'll click over here and just show you some additional resources. You can get those sample and also the student component examples, KnowAtom.com/curriculum. This case studies you can check out, KnowAtom.com/results. And I'd recommend, these things are all free to access. If you really want to scale it up and use it in your district with the hands-on materials and the full year-long curriculum and grade level specific and all that, obviously that's purchased. But everything I'm listing here you can access for free. The blog, you can subscribe there, KnowAtom.com/blog. Check us out on Facebook, follow us. We put a lot of things up there which are great to access and free. And Twitter. I'm going to grab some questions now as well. So we have a bunch here. See if I can grab at least 2 or 3. Okay, so some of the questions that have been asked. So for instance, does traditional lecture fit into an NJSS model? That's a really great question. The answer is no. Traditional lecture doesn't fit into the NJSS model, and I'm going to have to define traditional lecture. So going back to that example of the teacher being the expert in a traditional model, the teacher being the expert and explaining all about things, that's a traditional lecture. That doesn't fit this model because what we want students to do is to use their mind and to identify problems and questions and then be able to use skills to pursue a problem or to pursue a question and actually come to an evidence-based conclusion about it. And the way that you come to that evidence-based conclusion is to develop the data that's necessary to actually reflect on the problem or question or the potential answer to the question or the potential solution to the problem. So that's not something you can just blurt out and lecture to a student. Now, when you think about something like a Socratic dialogue is not a lecture, and I would recommend that resource. If you go to KnowAtom.com and you check at the top of the page, it says resources. You'll have to dig around a little bit, but we have a great 1-hour, really takes you through how to hold a next generation Socratic dialogue. I recommend engaging that resource. It's free. You can go here, KnowAtom.com/resources, and find your way to it. So a Socratic dialogue is asking questions which require the students to be able to engage their higher order thinking, to engage in creating, evaluating, or analyzing as they answer that question in class. And what you do is that you're asking those questions about the context, something, and so in our case, we start with nonfiction reading. It's not like a textbook, it's very different. It's much more like news articles that scaffold. But what you're doing is that by asking these higher order questions, students are engaging their higher order thinking, and they have to engage that thinking in the context of the concepts. And so that's where they begin really it's not a lecture. Students begin really thinking, and they're making concept to concept and concept to self and concept to world connections. And so what you're doing is as students are giving responses, you're not saying, that's right, that's wrong, and validating. What you're doing is you're asking their peers. So you're looking at a student saying, do you agree with that? Why? How? What would you use to support your agreement with that idea? Or you don't agree with it, why? What would you use to support that disagreement that you have? So you're forming what's called a triad, and you're doing that, looping students into this conversation. So it's not a lecture. What it is it's artfully leading students through thinking about different aspects. So it's much more skilled than lecturing. Computers can lecture. That's easy. What a really great question, though. So there's no, piece of that. And then when you think about a debrief, again, it's not about validating. It's about getting that same sort of higher order questioning and getting student teams to actually critique, and that's why I said earlier, a culture of critique their own ideas and form those connections. So another question here. Somebody asks about how does this relate to preparing students for college if students are going to be engaged in lecture halls and such things like that. Well, imagine students sitting in a lecture hall who can actually think about what's being told to them. That's how they're prepared. Whether that educator in the college classroom is lecturing, so they're just blurting out facts, okay, and explaining about something. A student needs to be able to think about that. If we're creating students who can purely function at the level of doing what they're told, that's not a student who's going to be college ready, certainly not career ready. Especially, students don't go to college even, so what? Well, they need to be prepared to function in the workplace, whether that's first stop is college or not. And it's a necessary skill on both fronts. So other questions involve engineering design process, and we've talked a bit about assessments as well. So engineering design process, I gave the example earlier of thinking about, we could think about the permeability of materials and investigate that as scientists, and I gave that example, and we can generate a lab ourselves as students, and I'll go back to this because this is a point worth looking at one more time really quickly. Give me 1 second. Here. So if you were familiar with the scientific process or engineering design process, they're different, but there are similarities, but there are very key differences. They're not interchangeable at all. People make that mistake all the time. But the key piece here is that that planned investigation in a scientific context is exposing students and helping them practice their practices, bit of a tongue twister. They're observing the phenomenon, they're developing and using the content of that disciplinary core idea in the context of science here, right? Which earth material is most permeable to groundwater? And students develop their plan off of that, carry out their plan, gather their data, form their conclusion. The very next lesson involves learning about pollution, and then, of course, how do they actually learn about that pollution? They actually deal with polluted, there's actually another activity in there too, but ultimately as engineers, they're engaging the engineering design process by dealing with the problem of a town needing a low-cost water filtration device. Now, there's a lot of different ways of engineering water filtration devices, but there's a set of resources which students have to consider and figure out some subset of those resources which they are going to use, prototype, so they diagram their prototype, they come up with a test for how they're going to test that prototype, and then actually build it, test it, and gather the data. And then they form an evidence-based conclusion. What I'm showing you is grade 7 level. Okay, so this is a concrete example of how science and engineering are related. Science being the permeability and how groundwater actually becomes groundwater and not surface water runoff, how pollution, which is at the surface, actually makes its way into groundwater, and how engineers can solve the problem of polluted groundwater by engineering water filtration devices to remove that pollution and maybe perhaps make that water potable, or at least gray water, not black water, or so on. So that's the connection here, and the way that students are going to be assessed, whether it's in the classroom, so you need to generate it yourself or come to an organization like ours and get this sort of all made for you, which nobody, I mean, some folks might do that, but if you have millions of dollars, you can have somebody make something for you specifically, but frankly, get something that is available to pull all these parts together, so you have that in your possession. And so the way we do it here is that we have these specific scenarios that are part of concept assessments, which require students to take what they've learned and apply that knowledge in an unfamiliar scenario, unfamiliar context, and we tease out the different dimensions of the foundations of the performance expectation. So the students have to perform the expectation in a novel context. So it shows us, can they synthesize with what they've learned? So that's, not to give you a long answer to the questions, but nonetheless, that's where it is. And there's been a number of questions about textbooks. Do you need textbooks? Are textbooks, should textbooks be electronic or not electronic, or so on? So frankly, do you need textbooks? The answer to that question is really no. You don't need textbooks. What you need is students to have a level of common background. Now, a textbook, traditional textbooks, and we're going to paint with a broad brush here, walk into a science conference and the biggest vendors that you will see there with the largest displays and all whatever, they're all textbook vendors, whether or not they also sell kits. Even those kit vendors are, the big ones are all textbook vendors, really. They kind of put a kit on there because hands-on learning became popular, and so you can sell a textbook better if you have some physical materials to put with it, right? But the bottom line here is that the way textbooks are traditionally created, and you can open any textbook you have in your school. It can be from the 70s, it can be from, the latest edition of the Pretty Picture textbook. What they do is they take a concept, and that'll be like the word in bold, and they will make a paragraph that explains that concept, and then they'll move on to the next one, and then the next one, and the next one. And they might have some breakout kind of vignettes that, real life application. The way we approach it, which is not a textbook approach, which is why I say you need common background, but you don't need textbooks. What we do is we take a concept and we anchor it in a real life context. So for instance, we will talk about things like groundwater by talking about real life sinkholes, where they exist and how, and we'll use something like the Bayou Corn sinkhole, which is a real sinkhole. You can Google it. You can go on Wikipedia. You can do whatever you want to do. This is real, and what we do is we take that concept and we bring it to life in the context of that real, sinkhole, and then we build on that by connecting it to the idea of the water cycle and the rock cycle and how that's actually happening in that real sinkhole, and so on and so forth. So you can imagine that it's not really a textbook, it's a nonfiction background context which anchors students' understanding of the concepts and the vocabulary in something that's real life, that's engaging, sort of the way that a newspaper would be, for instance. You can open, what I love about our reading material because of the way that we create it is that you can open any newspaper and you will find connections to what's in any of our readers any day, which is really great. There's no effort really required. And so what that does is that nonfiction reading component provides some common background that students can think about no matter where they are from. If students are completely new to the country, new to the town, whatever. That's just some common background that we can now all have a discussion about, which is important. So that's why I bring up this sort of cadence, which is a cadence that we use here, and I showed a diagram earlier, is that nonfiction reading comes first. But it's not really a textbook. It's common background. And it's something that takes 20 minutes, to read it. Depending on the grade level, it's sometimes assigned for homework. We come in and we talk about it. And that's where that's Socratic dialogue, asking those higher order questions. That's where we make the concept to concept and concept to self, concept to world connections that engage students further, because now this is part of a student's world that they better understand. And they came to that understanding on their own by our creative questioning as teachers. And now we can come to a problem or question where students can break into their teams, use their skills and their understanding of the processes to plan an investigation to try to solve the problem or answer the question, and then actually carry it out hands-on. So you can see that this is all about purpose. This establishes the purpose for the hands-on component. The students actually design through their plan what they're going to do hands-on, and that's them and their partner. They carry it out. Now they understand the purpose of what they're doing, right? Because they decided that, and they understand, really can reflect on their data, and that's why they're able to form these really robust evidence-based conclusions. So it's everyday preparation for life, but also for assessments, high-stakes assessments, and then as a result of this instruction to the end of the unit or so on, students can synthesize and even look at new contexts, and that's where those assessments I showed you earlier come into play. So it's not to give you a long answer to the textbook question, but it's really not as black and white as do we need textbooks or don't we. It's really that textbooks are broken. Even these online textbooks are as bad, and some of them are even worse than paper textbooks. Just because you can click on something and it has a nice picture doesn't it doesn't mean it has a lot of value. The value for student learning is investing the student in their own thinking, bringing their ideas to life, and developing skills which can be generalized and used to synthesize in any context or environment. So I apologize for having kept everyone here as long as we have. This will be available. I will have Mary Ellen blast a recording of this webinar out to everybody. Feel free to share with colleagues. It will at some point be made available on our website too, under our resources section. There can be a lag there though. You can also direct folks to the original link that you used to sign up. That page will take them to a recording of this webinar moving forward. So thank you again for your time. I really wish you the best of luck, and if we can be of any help in becoming a leader in the next generation science standards in your school or district, we would be happy to do that. Feel free to check out our resources, and thank you again for your time. Bye-bye.